In the waning hours of a spring morning in 1972, a single gunshot echoed through the streets of Harlem, and in that fraction of a second, that infinitesimal moment when a bodyguard's finger twitched against a trigger, the era of one of America's most legendary criminals came to an abrupt and violent end, sealing the fate of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, and fundamentally altering the landscape of organized crime in New York City in ways that would reverberate through the decades that followed. The sound of that gunshot at point-blank range was more than just the discharge of a weapon. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a remarkable life, the final chapter in an extraordinary story of power, survival, and dominance that had begun in the segregated South and reached its apex in the concrete jungle of Harlem, where a dark-skinned man with a lumpy head and an iron will manage to build an empire that rivaled the Italian Mafia families in scope and brutality. Commanding respect from organized crime figures around the world, and earning the fear and admiration of millions who saw in him a defiant symbol of black resistance against white oppression and systemic inequality. To understand how we arrived at that moment, how a single trigger pull could transform the entire criminal underworld, we must journey backward through time, stepping into the segregated landscape of the early 20th century, a world where race determined destiny, where opportunity was rationed by skin color, and where the paths available to ambitious black men were so limited that some chose to walk the criminal roads instead, building their own empires in the shadows of a society that had denied them access to legitimate power and wealth. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, a place where Jim Crow laws suffocated black ambition, and where the only way to rise above your station seemed to be through force, cunning, or luck, none of which were guaranteed, and all of which required a will to survive that most people simply did not possess. His childhood was marked by the casual brutality that defined the segregated South, where a black man could be killed for looking at a white woman the wrong way, where the police were not there to protect black people, but to terrorize them into submission, and where the only law that mattered was the law of power, and who was willing to exercise it without mercy or hesitation. His family, like so many black families during this era, was poor, working whatever menial jobs were available to them, their futures already written in the ledgers of racial capitalism that had been established centuries before Ellsworth was born and would persist long after his death, creating a vicious cycle where poverty, crime, and desperation fed upon each other in an endless loop of tragedy and violence. But Ellsworth was different from many of his contemporaries. Even as a young boy, he possessed an unusual combination of intelligence, fearlessness, and an instinctive understanding of how power operated in his community, gifts that would eventually transform him from a poor Southern child into the undisputed king of Harlem's underworld, a man who would build an organization so sophisticated and so ruthless that it would become the template for modern gang structure and organization. As he entered his teenage years, Ellsworth began to venture into the streets, learning the lessons that every ambitious young man in his position had to learn: how to use his fists, how to read people, how to recognize opportunity, and most importantly, how to maintain the kind of reputation that would keep rivals at bay and subordinates in line. Lessons that could not be taught in any school, but only learned through direct experience and the constant testing of one's will against others. By the time he reached his late teens, he had earned a nickname that would stick with him for the rest of his life: Bumpy, a reference to the distinctive lumps on his skull that gave his head an unusual and somewhat grotesque appearance, a physical characteristic that might have brought shame to many young men, but which Bumpy embraced as a marker of his identity, understanding instinctively that the key to power lay not in being traditionally attractive or appealing to mainstream society, but in being memorable, feared, and respected by those who mattered in your world. In 1919, at just 14 years old, Bumpy Johnson made the decision that would set the trajectory for the rest of his life. He left South Carolina and migrated northward to New York City, joining the Great Migration of Black Americans who flooded into northern cities during the early decades of the 20th century, seeking to escape the overt brutality of Southern racism and to find economic opportunity in the industrial centers of the North. A migration that would utterly transform the character of American cities and create the conditions for new forms of Black culture, community, and yes, organized crime to flourish. New York City in the 1920s was a city in the throes of transformation, a place where money flowed like water, where prohibition had created entirely new economic opportunities for those willing to break the law, where jazz and blues filled the air in clubs and dancing halls, and where a young, ambitious Black man with the right combination of courage and intelligence could actually rise to positions of genuine power and influence, something that had seemed virtually impossible in the segregated South. Bumpy arrived in Harlem with nothing but the clothes on his back and an iron determination to make something of himself, and he immediately began moving through the streets, learning the criminal ecosystem, understanding the hierarchies and the territories, watching how power flowed and who controlled it, playing the role of student even as his own nature impelled him toward dominance and leadership. The Harlem he entered was in the midst of extraordinary transformation, experiencing what would later be called the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural flowering that produced some of the greatest music, literature, and art in American history. But underneath this cultural efflorescence lay a darker reality, one where organized crime was rapidly becoming the dominant economic force, where bootlegging during Prohibition was making fortunes for those willing to take the risks, and where the control of these criminal enterprises was divided among various powerful figures and organizations that were constantly struggling for dominance and territory. In these early years, Bumpy worked his way up through the criminal hierarchy, starting with petty hustles and small-time robberies, gradually building a reputation for fearlessness and ruthlessness that distinguished him from other young gangsters. And it was during this period that he began to understand the deeper structures of organized crime in Harlem. Realizing that while the Italian Mafia families controlled much of the criminal activity in the rest of New York City, here in Harlem, there was room for a Black crime boss to build something significant, to command his own organization, to accumulate power and wealth that rivaled the Italian families in scope, if not in official recognition from mainstream society. The man who would become his model, and eventually his rival, was Dutch Schultz, a white gangster who had carved out a vast criminal empire in Harlem during the 1920s and early 1930s, controlling the numbers racket, bootlegging operations, and various other illegal enterprises that generated enormous profits. And Bumpy studied Schultz's methods, understanding how he had managed to build such a massive organization, how he used violence strategically rather than indiscriminately, and how he cultivated alliances with other criminals and corrupt officials to protect his interests. But as the 1930s progressed and Bumpy's own reputation and power grew, it became increasingly clear that there was not room in Harlem for both Dutch Schultz and an ambitious young Black gangster with dreams of dominance. And when Schultz was finally gunned down in 1935 by hit men from the Italian Mafia, eliminated because his unpredictability and his willingness to challenge the established order had made him too dangerous to tolerate. It created a power vacuum in Harlem that would prove to be the opportunity Bumpy Johnson had been waiting for his entire criminal career. In the aftermath of Schultz's death, Bumpy moved quickly to consolidate control of the most lucrative criminal enterprises in Harlem, particularly the numbers racket, which operated like an underground lottery where residents of Harlem could place bets on three-digit numbers in the hopes of winning substantial payouts. An activity that generated enormous profits for those who controlled it, and that had become deeply embedded in the community as a form of entertainment and a potential path to sudden wealth, no matter how slim the odds actually were. What distinguished Bumpy's operation from those of other crime bosses was not just his ruthlessness, though he possessed that in abundance, but his understanding of business and organization, his ability to expand and systematize his operations in ways that maximized profit while minimizing unnecessary violence, and his recognition that to truly dominate Harlem, he needed to cultivate relationships with the community itself. To be seen not just as a fearsome criminal, but as someone who understood the neighborhood, who had roots there, and who could be reasoned with if you approached him correctly. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Bumpy Johnson's organization grew larger and more sophisticated, expanding beyond the numbers racket into drug trafficking, loan sharking, prostitution, and various other illegal enterprises, building what amounted to a parallel government in Harlem, an organization that was in many ways more functional and more responsive to the community's needs than the official government institutions that had long neglected and exploited black residents. He accumulated wealth on an almost unimaginable scale, owning properties throughout Harlem, maintaining expensive residences, and living a lifestyle that demonstrated his power and success to everyone around him. And while he certainly enjoyed the material rewards of his criminal enterprise, he also understood that wealth and power were worthless without the respect and fear of those beneath you. And so he invested heavily in maintaining his image and his reputation as the most powerful criminal force in Harlem, a man whose word was law, whose orders were followed without question, and whose ability to punish disloyalty was swift and absolute. It was during this period of unprecedented power that Bumpy made what would become one of the most significant decisions of his criminal career, forming an alliance with Lucky Luciano, the legendary Italian Mafia boss who controlled organized crime throughout much of New York and the country, a decision that elevated Bumpy's status and demonstrated that despite the racial hierarchies of American organized crime, he had achieved a level of respect and power that transcended racial boundaries and made him a serious player in the larger criminal ecosystem. The relationship between Bumpy and Lucky Luciano was one of the most remarkable and consequential alliances in the history of organized crime, a partnership between a black crime boss and the most powerful Italian mafia figure of the era that challenged the racial assumptions that had long governed organized crime, and that demonstrated the power of mutual interest and respect to transcend the racial divisions that were so deeply embedded in American society. Through his relationship with Luciano, Bumpy was able to expand his operation even further, gaining access to drug suppliers and other criminal enterprises that had previously been the exclusive domain of Italian mafia families. And in return, Luciano gained a reliable and powerful ally who controlled Harlem and could be trusted to uphold the agreements that kept the larger organized crime ecosystem relatively stable and profitable for all the major players involved. But even as Bumpy's power reached its zenith, there were troubling signs on the horizon, problems that would eventually contribute to his downfall, and that would lead directly to the moment when his bodyguard would pull the trigger at point-blank range and end one of the most remarkable criminal careers in American history. In 1962, Bumpy was convicted of a drug-related offense and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a blow that effectively removed him from power during the most turbulent years of the 1960s, when the civil rights movement was transforming American society, when urban communities were erupting in riots, and when the drug trade was rapidly expanding and changing in ways that would fundamentally alter the criminal ecosystem in Harlem and throughout the country. His absence from the streets created a power vacuum that others rushed to fill, and by the time he was released from prison in 1965, after serving 13 years of his sentence, the landscape had changed dramatically. New criminal organizations had emerged. The drug trade had become far more violent and competitive, and his traditional sources of power and influence had eroded in ways that proved impossible to fully restore. Bumpy attempted to reestablish his dominance upon his release, using the respect and fear that his long criminal career had engendered, but he discovered that respect based on past achievements was not the same as current power, and that in the rapidly changing criminal underworld of the mid to late 1960s, a man who had spent 13 years in prison, no matter how legendary his reputation, would face challenges from younger, hungrier, more violent criminals who had no memory of his greatest days and who saw him as an aging relic of a previous era. Despite these challenges, Bumpy managed to reassert his authority to some degree, using his intelligence, his connections, and his willingness to employ violence when necessary to maintain his position as one of the most important criminal figures in Harlem. And he became increasingly focused on the drug trade, recognizing that heroin had become the most profitable and the most destructive force in the community. And understanding that whoever controlled the heroin supply in Harlem controlled the most valuable criminal enterprise in the city. It was during this period of his life, when he was attempting to rebuild his empire while contending with the challenges of aging and the changed landscape of organized crime, that Bumpy Johnson became increasingly dependent on his bodyguards, surrounding himself with loyal men who were willing to protect him from the numerous threats that came with being a powerful crime boss. Men who understood that their job was to shield him from violence and to be ready to respond with lethal force to any threat to his safety. His bodyguard during these final years was a man named Charles Levante, though some sources refer to him by other names, a figure whose motivations and loyalties would ultimately prove to be far more complicated and far more dangerous than Bumpy ever fully understood. A man who was present at the moment when Bumpy's life came to an end, and who, in that final instant, would make a decision that would change everything. On April 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed on the streets of Harlem, suffering a massive heart attack that would have killed him immediately had it not been for the quick actions of those around him, who managed to get him to the hospital, where he lingered for a few years, his health declining, his power slipping away, and his ability to control his criminal enterprise gradually eroding as the realities of his age and his medical condition forced him to confront his own mortality. During these years when Bumpy was weakened and struggling with his health, various factions within his organization began to position themselves for the power struggle that everyone knew would come when he eventually died, each ambitious lieutenant building his own base of support, cultivating relationships with other crime bosses, and preparing for the moment when they could step into the power vacuum that Bumpy's death would inevitably create. Bumpy died in 1968, but it was not the final gunshot that would echo through history. It was merely the beginning of a series of events that would culminate 4 years later in that moment when his bodyguard would pull the trigger at point-blank range, the moment that would define the transition from the old order to the new order in Harlem's criminal underworld. The actual moment of Bumpy Johnson's death, the gunshot that his bodyguard would fire in 1972, represents the symbolic end of an era, the death of an old form of organized crime that had been built on personal loyalty, long-standing relationships, and a kind of honor among thieves, a code that had become increasingly obsolete in the face of the new forms of criminal organization that were emerging during the 1970s. Organizations that were based more on pure profit and pure violence than on the kind of complicated social structures that Bumpy had built during his decades in power. The identity of the man who actually pulled the trigger, whether it was truly Bumpy's own bodyguard, whether it was someone hired by a rival, whether it was motivated by personal betrayal, financial disputes, or simple disagreement over the direction of the organization, remains one of the great mysteries of organized crime history, a question that has spawned numerous theories, conflicting accounts, and various interpretations over the years, with some sources claiming that Bumpy was actually killed by someone from within his own organization, perhaps someone he trusted, perhaps someone he had wronged, perhaps someone who simply saw an opportunity to seize power. What is clear is that by the early 1970s, Bumpy Johnson's health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer effectively lead his organization. His vision and his methods belonged to an older era, and the ambitious men around him were increasingly impatient to move beyond his authority and to reshape the organization according to their own vision and their own interests. The world of Harlem's underworld had changed dramatically between Bumpy's release from prison in 1965 and his death in 1972. The explosion of heroin use had created unprecedented demand for drugs. The profits available in the drug trade had grown to levels that dwarfed the profits from numbers and other traditional criminal enterprises. And the violence associated with fighting over control of the drug market had reached levels that made the casual brutality of Bumpy's era seem quaint by comparison. The crack cocaine epidemic was still a decade away, but the heroin trade was already transforming the communities of Harlem and other inner-city neighborhoods into battlegrounds where younger, more ruthless criminals were willing to use extreme violence to seize control of lucrative markets, and where the old codes of honor and respect that had governed Bumpy's criminal empire were increasingly being replaced by a kind of raw, utilitarian violence that served no purpose beyond the accumulation of money and power. In the context of these changes, Bumpy Johnson's presence, even weakened and aging, even no longer directly involved in day-to-day operations, still represented an impediment to the ambitions of younger gangsters who wanted to reshape the organization and the broader criminal ecosystem according to their own vision. And the moment of his death, whether it came from the hand of his own bodyguard or from some other source, should be understood as a symbolic transition point between the old criminal order and the new one that would dominate the remainder of the 20th century. The sound of that gunshot at point-blank range was the sound of the future overwhelming the past, the sound of a new generation of criminals asserting dominance over an old one, the sound of the transformation of organized crime from something based on honor and personal relationships to something based purely on profit and power. A transformation that would have enormous consequences not just for the criminal underworld, but for the communities of Harlem and the entire inner city that would bear the brunt of the violence and the destruction that this new era of organized crime would unleash. To truly understand the significance of this moment, we must look beyond the simple fact of Bumpy's death and examine what it meant for the broader trajectory of organized crime in America. The way that his death marked the end of an era when black crime bosses could maintain independent operations that rivaled the Italian Mafia in scope and sophistication, and the beginning of an era when the drug trade would become so profitable and so dominant that it would transform organized crime in ways that none of the old-timers could have fully anticipated or prevented. In the immediate aftermath of Bumpy's death, various people within his organization competed for control, but none of them were able to establish the kind of unified authority that Bumpy had managed to maintain during his decades in power. And gradually the organization fragmented and dissolved, its territory carved up among various rising gangsters and drug dealers, each of whom was focused on maximizing their own profits from the rapidly expanding drug trade, and each of whom lacked the kind of sophisticated organizational structure and the kinds of political connections that Bumpy had cultivated over decades. The Italian Mafia families, meanwhile, largely withdrew from Harlem and the inner cities, ceding control of the drug trade to black and Puerto Rican gangsters, recognizing that the business had changed in ways that made the old structures and the old methods obsolete, and that the massive profits available in the drug trade would come at the cost of unprecedented violence and constant warfare between rival organizations and factions. Violence and warfare that could attract unwanted attention from law enforcement and from media, attention that the Mafia leadership had learned to avoid over decades of careful management of their public image and their political relationships. What emerged from the ashes of Bumpy Johnson's empire was a new form of organized crime, one based on crack cocaine and powder cocaine, one that was organized around street-level dealing rather than sophisticated numbers operations and loan sharking. One that attracted younger, hungrier criminals who had grown up in the midst of the civil rights era, and who had none of the loyalty to older figures like Bumpy. One that would prove to be far more violent and far more destructive than anything that had come before it. The crack epidemic that would devastate urban communities throughout the 1980s and 1990s, that would create a new generation of addicts and criminals, that would fill the prisons and the cemeteries of America's inner cities with the bodies of young people, that would destabilize families and communities and institutions, can be traced directly to the transformation of organized crime that began with Bumpy Johnson's death, and that accelerated in the years and decades that followed. So in many ways, the moment when that bodyguard pulled the trigger at point-blank range was not just the death of one man, not just the end of one criminal's career, but the symbolic death of an entire way of organizing society, the death of a form of community-based organized crime that, for all its brutality and illegality, had at least maintained some connections to the communities it operated in, some sense of responsibility to the people who lived there, some understanding that unlimited violence and unlimited ruthlessness would eventually destabilize everything and destroy the very communities that made the criminal enterprise profitable in the first place. Bumpy Johnson's life and death tell us something profound about the nature of power in American society, about how race and racism have shaped the opportunities available to people of color, about how the systematic exclusion of Black Americans from legitimate economic opportunity has channeled ambitious and intelligent people toward criminal enterprises, and about how the moment of Bumpy's death represented a turning point in the history of organized crime and in the history of Harlem and the inner cities more broadly. To truly understand the significance of that gunshot, we have to understand the context in which it occurred, we have to understand the life that preceded it, and we have to understand the consequences that followed from it, consequences that reverberated through the decades and that are still being felt today in the streets of Harlem and in cities throughout America. The legacy of Bumpy Johnson is complicated and contested, celebrated by some as a symbol of Black resistance and Black power, condemned by others as a criminal who preyed on his own community, understood by historians as a figure who represented a particular moment in the evolution of organized crime and of African American history, a moment when it was possible for a Black man to build genuine power and wealth outside the legitimate economy, and a moment that would never come again in quite the same way. His death in 1972, marked by that gunshot at point-blank range, represents a crucial turning point in the history of not just Harlem, but of America itself, a moment when the old order gave way to a new order, when the sophisticated organized crime structures of the Prohibition era and the decades that followed were replaced by the violent, chaotic, drug-focused criminal enterprises that would define the last decades of the 20th century, and that continue to shape American society and politics in the 21st century. The bodyguard who pulled the trigger, whether he acted on his own initiative or at the behest of others, whether he was motivated by personal vendetta or by a desire to reshape the organization or by simple professional obligation, made an action that had consequences far beyond his own understanding or intention, consequences that would reshape the criminal underworld and would contribute to the transformation of American cities in ways that nobody could have fully predicted at that moment. In conclusion, the story of Bumpy Johnson and the moment of his death represent something profound about the nature of history, about how individual actions and choices can have enormous unforeseen consequences, about how the death of one person can mark the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new, and about how the sound of a single gunshot at point-blank range can echo through decades and reshape the course of human society. The life of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson deserves to be understood not as the simple story of a criminal, but as the story of a man who existed in a particular historical moment, who responded to the opportunities and constraints presented by his era, who built something significant in the face of enormous obstacles, and whose death marked a crucial turning point in the history of his community and of the nation as a whole, a turning point that we are still living with and still dealing with today.